Ed, it's good to see you. So I have always been mystified by the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Mystified by it, and at the same time, kind of terrified by it that I was going to get invited to something, be invited to Simchat Beit HaShoeva. And like, how do you act at that, right? I mean, I was always expecting some kind of activity, but like, are we going to actually draw water? And when I was Choser B'Tshuva, I remember the Lincoln Square Synagogue. We went to some place and I had no idea what was going on. And we were all asked to recite Psalms. And that just traumatized me more than anything else, right? So I'm trying to work it out, and to work it out without going into mystical city, right? Meaning to try to stay grounded. And I think Chazal actually do give us the chance to be grounded. Of course, Simchat Beit HaShoeva really lends itself to that kind of mysticism, right? What was this ceremony? This water drawing ceremony during the days of Sukkot, days and nights, where water would be brought in different quantities and offered or sacrificed, and it would go from the Ezras Nashim, I think, to the Ezras Yisrael, something like that. I mean, the Gemara in Sukkot, or the Mishnayot in Sukkot, go into great detail exactly how this happened. So one of the reasons I think we're in a better position now to understand Simchat Beit HaShoeva is because we spend so much time learning Psalms, and we see how important water is in Psalms, right? And just starting here, right? First of all, the first quote, and as you'll see, there's a practice that comes from the Gemara that people would sing the 15 Shir HaMalot after what David ostensibly did at the temple, and we'll see that in a minute. But I think it's very important, and this is true on a cosmic and also on a psychological level. A cosmic and also a psychological level, that in order to go up, you have to go down. So the first of the Song of Ascents, Shir HaMalot, Ma'amikim Karaticha Hashem. Out of the depths, I called you. So be very aware of the graphic metaphors that are present not only in Psalms, but also in the Agaritas and Gemaras that we'll look at, to see in what sense, what that means, that in order to go up, one has to go down. And I think we should keep that in mind in both a cosmic and also a psychological level. We'll talk a little bit more about water. First, I just want to read this Mishnah in Sukkos. We'll do it in English. Chasidim va'anshe ma'isa, right? That's Hebrew. The pious and men of action. Chasidim va'anshe ma'isa. Hi, Tikva. Hi, Ed. These are two separate groups, right? They're two separate groups of people. They're Anshe Maisa.
Necessarily.
Good. I'm glad you said that, Tikva. Not necessarily, right? I like the not necessarily.
Yeah. The men of action, by the way, poor translation. I would say men of deeds.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Here's an extra credit question. I mean, Dov just mentioned Aristotle. Who in Aristotle's metaphysics does this remind you of? Anshe Maisa. It is a bonus question. Remember when we learned the poetics?
Yes.
Do you remember that?
That is the bit of that course I grasped the best. It's the masterworker.
Oh. The joys of pedagogy. Right, the masterworker, because Aristotle talks about the figure who mediates between practice and theory. In some way, without getting fully into it, it's a rebuke to Plato. Is really bring philosophy down to earth. Tzorachian, right? You got to see. We have to learn the poetics. I have a lecture online about the poetics, which is great. I mean, just because Aristotle is amazing. Okay, so the pious and the men of action would dance before the Fnem, the Abokacho, or Shabiyadehen. We have this very vivid scene that gets painted, right? And they would sing Shirot v'Tishbachot. The Gemara goes on and asks, what does it mean to sing? What is song? Is song b'peh or song with an instrument? Of course, it's machloket. And the Levites would play on lyres, harps, cymbals, and trumpets, and countless other musical instruments. It's a strange moment of kind of Rabelaisian excess here. But I mean, I don't know if you read Rabelais, probably nobody did, but I did when I was in Lit-Hum at Columbia. Rabelais just would list tons and tons of things, right? Of whatever he would be talking about, he'd have these long, long lists. And this begins to kind of approximate that. There's so many things about the description of this celebration in the Mishnah that were really, and also in the Gemara, that we're not accustomed to seeing in other places. I mean, the Mishnah is really going out of its way to give us a vivid description of this. Of course, it's also very interesting to remember that none of this was actually happening at the time that the Mishnah was being composed. So all of this is a linguistic construct. And again, you know me, I'm not saying that to demean it, right? It elevates it as far as I'm concerned, right? But they are remembering and bringing this practice into the present by describing it. So they would stand on the 15 stairs that descend from the Israelite court to the women's court, the Ezus Nashim, corresponding to the 15 Shira Malos, 120 to 134, as we were just saying. And then the Levites would sing. And here's an interesting part. Our ancestors who were in this place, and all the Meforshim say, he's talking about, that's why it's filled in here. We're talking about Jews in the first temple, not foreigners, not Sadducees, and those people will come into play here. Heretics will come into play here, but here these are Jews, non-Jewish heretics will come into play, and they recite, they stood with their backs toward the sanctuary of the Lord and their faces toward the east, and they worship the sun toward the east, and our eyes are to God. Rabbi Yehuda said, Rabbi Yehuda, Omer ha-yeshonin v'oimrin anu liyah, v'liyah einenu. Beautiful, right? It's this kind of poetic thing, right? We reject that practice of the past, and our eyes are on God. Try to make sense of who see entered the waiting room. Wow, it's just like, this is just amazing. We'll try to make sense of this. Another important, I'm just going to do a little bit of handout manipulation as we speak. So the Gemara actually asks about this. Like, what was this practice exactly? That is, while the Simchat Beit HaShoeva was going on, some of the ancestors would turn their backs, worship the sun, and the Gemara explains their backs towards the sanctuary. Milamed shahayu porin atzma umatrizin klape mata. It teaches that they would expose themselves and defecate downwards. I see, right? Now, and talk about Rabelais, right? The physicality, right? It's a weird thing to be included here. And as we discuss this, I'd like to think about how it makes sense, what the refusal of this ritual represents, and how this particular act manifests that refusal. Now, let's just make sure I'm getting everything here right. So let's see, there are other things that are included here. There's another story which is bizarre, right? So Rabbi Yehuda goes on to describe the practice, and it says at the end there's a direction. Hagba yadecha, you should hold your hand up high. Shapam echad nisech echad al gabe ragla, because there was a time when somebody and this was the Sadducee, right? And the Sadducees reject the oral law, and the simplest Beit HaShoeva is halacha Mimoshe Misinai, right? It has that's what they say, right? So it's of a rabbinic origin. So the Sadducees, they make their way into the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, and instead of being like the people in the first temple who are desecrating this action, well, here they're desecrating it in their own way. They're pouring the water on their feet instead of on the temple grounds. And again, I keep on thinking of like Rabelais is kind of like the father of a certain kind of comic excess. And here, all the people, kol ha'am v'ragmuhu kol ha'am be'etrogehen. So, like, I don't know, I'm feeling more comfortable. All the years when I learned this, I thought, this is bizarre. And I'm kind of seeing it like a Charlie Chaplin movie, because that's kind of what it really sounds like. There seems to be this comic element there. It's hard to explain, like, in other places, there's another Gemara that says that the wicks that they made to illuminate all of Jerusalem, they made out of the pants of the Kohanim. And I don't know what to make of that. in the Rishonim, they talk about, oh well, it was the kind of pants that they wore, and it was a certain kind of wick that they wanted to make, right? I mean, and they later like take it completely out of its context and turn it into a halachic issue. It seems to me to be saying like this also darsheni. What's it doing there?
Can you please repeat the story about the Kohanim trousers?
There's a Gemara that says that they made their wicks for that illuminated all of Jerusalem. They took the old trousers of the Kohanim. It's a Mishnah, and they made books out of them. Okay, and here's another part, right? And here, I mean, it's a pretty amazing that, I don't know, it took me so long to see this really, that there's so much emphasis on play, right? This is just one example of, it goes through different Tanaim and talks about what they did in order to celebrate. So Tanya, Amru Level Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, they said about him, when he was celebrating, he would take these, he would juggle with these torches of fire. In another place, it talks about this and other things that were dangerous, but nonetheless, they did them, right? I mean, just like the follow-up to the esrogim thing is like, we don't throw esrogim on the ground, right? It's because we value them so much. And here, it seems like there's this other excessive practice. Did he really do that? You know, are you somech on a nes? I mean, you know, somebody will say that like this, right? But the Gemara does go out of the way to emphasize this place of safe play, I think, of play. Okay, so we started out. Yes, see.
Today is my mother's memorial, the Yortzeit.
So let's do this. Leah's neshamash of your mother. What's her name?
Yeah. Can we dedicate it? Yeah, to her.
What's her name?
Her name was Ronit, Bat Yosef Zev Shoshana.
Ronit Bat Yosef Zev, and this should be in her memory, and we should in her memory learn good things. Right. So let's get back to the source that I've been kind of avoiding. And this is a Tosfos, which is citing the Yerushalmi. For those of you who don't know, the Tosfot, it's 2 pages on the Gemara. There's the Gemara itself, Rashi on the inside, Tosfos on the outside. Tosfos are the grandchildren largely of Rashi, and they're largely asking questions on Rashi or asking questions on one Gemara in relationship to other Gemarot. Good description, Dov? Passes, yeah? Right, yeah. So they say, what did they do? Right, when they were engaged in this activity, they were shovim, they were drawing, they were harvesting ruach hakodesh. Shashchina shora mitoch simcha, because the Shechina only dwells among simcha, and then it goes on to say, well, this, if you're not, Shechina only rests on people who are in a state of simcha. So this is just another variable really to think about in relationship to the things that we've been thinking about so far. And it's really mikatzeh lekatzeh. We're going from what I'm claiming is the kind of comic world of play that the Mishnayot themselves describe. And then Tosfos saying, well, really what they were doing, these Anshe Ma'aseh and Hasidim, is they were harvesting, they were drawing out Ruach HaKodesh. Now, we really have to understand what water represents. And I know Tikva and Ed and Michael, we worked hard together to kind of see the valence of water in Psalms. And water is a recurring theme. Now, I chose some that are part of the 120 to 134 here, and just psukim, right? The psalmist says the water, Azeh hamayim shatfunu, nechala avar al nafshenu. We would have been, the water in Psalms very often threatens with the total erasure of identity. The Radak makes it literal, interestingly, hamayim mashal etzarot, meaning the water is a symbol of being washed over by the life, the tzarot of life, lo aleinu, that make it impossible for us to pursue our identity, right? The erasure of identity. Now, water has this very negative valence, and there are many, many places we could see it. This is just one example. Here, we get a sense of, let's see this. Mala nisim ikseha aretz barakim lamater. He makes cloud rise from the end of the earth. Asamotzeru, and he makes lightning for the rain. Barakim lamatar. Asamotzeruach me'otzorotav. And he releases the wind from his vaults. Now those vaults, interesting. I got this wrong here. I thought it was talking about the water being in the vaults, but here it's actually the wind that's in the vaults, and it's God who's actually creating the wind. There are other, God here, I think what's important is that God controls the deep. God is not only controlling things that are above, he also controls the deep. That's the ambivalence of water in Psalms. I know Ed had some amazing insights about this, that water simultaneously seems to be threatening to break through, yet on the other hand, the divine always has it covered. And see, there are parts of Milton in Paradise Lost where we see this, right? Satan raising his head, but God really knowing all about it. And you get that kind of double vision in Psalms at the same time. It's useful because it allows simultaneously for the perspective of the individual feeling overwhelmed by tzorot, but also having faith, and these two things are not incompatible, having faith that the divine is still there. Of course, the former makes the latter very, very difficult because the experience of the tzorot seem to sometimes have their own agency. You know what I mean by that, right? That's the Satan, right? It seems to have its own agency. And of course, it doesn't. It can't, because if once you say that, you're a Manichaean. So it's got to be a metaphor for something. So and here God is saying, David is saying God is not a Manichaean, right? He creates everything. Here's a beautiful Psalm 46, where you see both things kind of in balance. God is our hope and our strength, is the Geneva Bible, and help in troubles ready to be found. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be moved and the mountains fall into the midst of the sea. The sea is a destructive force. Here is really powerful. The waters rage and be troubled, and the mountains shake at the surge of the same. Yet, what pasuk is this? Daled Yehemu Yachmaru Meimav Yarshu Harim Begavoto Selah. I'm not really getting that. Let's see what the translation says. There is a river whose stream shall make the city of God, even the sanctuary of the tabernacles of the Most High. That's not what I just read, is it? Through the waters thereof, I just read the wrong pasuk, right? Because it's a little bit out of order. Right, so we'll just stick with the Geneva. Yet there is a river whose stream shall make the glad the city of God, even the sanctuary of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of it, right? So here we have the interesting doubling. On the one hand, we see the powers of water unleashed, the waters that rage, and in this amazing transition in Psalm 46, in Tikva and Ed, you may remember it comes in that series after Psalm 45, where there's a kind of marriage between the king and the other nations of the world. And after that psalm, the rest of the psalms in this particular cycle of psalms kind of really chill out. So we simultaneously get this very powerful image of water as a destructive force, but also water that gets civilized. Where does it get civilized? In the Mishkan, right?
May I?
Yes, Tikva, you may.
One of the elements of Sukkot is that Sukkot is a holiday in which we bring sacrifices for the other nations, for Umot HaOlam. And we bring 70 sacrifices, one for each nation. Right. And so this is another element of that being in contact with the other nations.
Okay, good, right. And Sukkot, and this is what distinguishes Sukkot from Shmini Atzeret, as Tikva points out, Sukkot is really a universal holiday, and Shmini Atzeres, all the midrashim say, this is the extra day for God and His people, right? That's the Shmini Atzeres is the holiday of particularism, right? Good. So here's another pasuk which demonstrates what we're talking about. Whatever the Lord desires, He does in heaven and earth, in the seas and all the depths. Kol asher chafetz Hashem asa b'shamayim u'ba'aretz b'yamim b'chol tu'umot. So before we mentioned the winds in their vaults, and here we actually see the waters in their depths, right? These they're described in other places. The Shittin, I think. It's interesting that, as we'll see, David is in the Midrash. He is responsible for founding the temple, even though he can't build it. He provides, or he builds, the foundations of the temple. So here we see, and we'll get to that midrash in just a second. Here we see again this. It really is in Tehillim a kind of denial of a God of dualism, because you can't. God is also in the depths. You hear me on that one? Meaning, if we're tempted to spiritualize God away from the material, the psalmist really prevents us from doing this. Or let's say, from a philosophical perspective, if we're accustomed to, as many of us are, to this mind-body distinction that we've inherited from Descartes, and it's gone through many, many manifestations, the psalmist, and this is what literature does that philosophy does not do, Dov, and that's why literature is better than philosophy, as Aristotle says, because he doesn't quite say that, because it doesn't worry about these artificial distinctions. So where a certain kind of philosopher will have to make a distinction between mind and body, that's what happens in the 17th century, which freaks everybody out. The poet doesn't have to do that. And the poet is not being inaccurate. The poet is just using a kind of language, usually a language of paradox, which is able to grasp or represent an experience that philosophers simply can't. Okay, so this then, here we'll come to the midrashim that I've been mentioning. So this is Rashi on the first of those psalms, and he's giving pshat on Shir HaMalot, what this means. A song of ascent, which the Levites will recite on the 15 steps that go down from the Israelites' court to the women's court. And there are 15 psalms that are called Shir HaMalot. And our rabbi said, so here now Rashi is telling us that these Shir HaMalot should be related to the Agaritas that the rabbis told us. And our rabbi said that David composed them to raise the deep, as explained in Sukkah, and according to the Agada in Yerushalmi. Okay, so Rashi is introducing us to this idea that these Shir HaMalot are associated with David's founding of the temple, and that's kind of confusing, but there's this kind of complex mesh of the psalmist and the Medrash and Simchat Beit HaShoeva, I think, as we'll see. Okay, so let's see. Right. So we'll read through that. It's a long story. So the Mishnah continues. The musicians would stand on 15 stairs that descend from the Israelite court to the women's courtyard, corresponding to the 15 songs. Rav Chisda said to one of the sages who was organizing the Agada, putting stuff together, did you hear with regard to the 15 songs of Shir HaMalot in Psalms corresponding to what David said to them? He said to him, this is what Rabbi Yochanan said. At the time that David dug the drain pipes, the depths rose, that he's actually beginning to, he's putting in the plumbing, he's putting in the foundation of the temple. The depths rose and sought to inundate the world. David recited the 15 songs of ascent, the Shir HaMalot, and caused them to subside. So here's a Talmudic joke. Rav Chisda said, they should be called Shir Yardot, right? They're called Shir Malos, and the activity that you just described is going down and not up. So Rav Chisda continues and said to him, so now he's saying basically, I think Rav Chisda is basically telling this other Amara that you're not the right guy to put the Medrash together. Let me tell you how it really goes. Rav Chisda continued and said to him, since you reminded me of this matter, at the time that David dug the drain pipes, the Shittin, the waters of the depths rose and sought to inundate the world. So here we're encountering this force of water as this possibly destructive force. So then, and then I get a little narrative. Is there anyone who knows whether it is permitted to write the sacred name? He wrote the, and David goes ahead and does this. He wrote the sacred name on an earthenware shard and cast it into the depths. And the depth subsided 16,000 feet. Oh, so now this is also interesting, right? We do have a dualism between law and whatever those forces are. I mean, it's not a hard leap to think about kind of the relationship between law and desire, right? We have to think about what is this force? What does it represent, this force that's coming up? And certainly one way of thinking about it is to think about it as this kind of like, it's almost like the divine unconscious. It's pushing itself up. So interestingly, he writes the divine name, and then he wants to know whether it's permitted to do it. And he asks again, does he ask twice? No, he wrote the sacred name first, and then I guess he has second thoughts about it. And he asked, does anybody, I'm afraid to have done this. What's the problem with having done it? He's writing the divine name. And in writing the divine name, he knows the divine name is going to be erased, interestingly. It is going to hold the waters back, but the divine name may be erased, is going to be erased. So Achitophel, then he says, and David says, anybody who does, so we get this drama here. Apparently David is waiting for somebody to justify what he's doing. And Achitophel, where we remember him, he's the big Talmud Chacham. He's the guy who knows everything. He's the big rationalist. So he finally speaks up and he gives a call b'chomer, and he says, just like you can in the issue of a sota, erase the divine name in the ceremony that surrounds her, so also kol v'chomer, when you're trying to save the world, you can also do this. And he said, so far, so he's like the posek, and he says to David, after he's already done it, you can do it. Now, David, just an interesting side thing. David says, let anybody who holds back, let them be strangled. Tikva, how did Achitophel die?
I do not remember, but let me guess.
He got hung. He was hung, right? So Rav Chisda, it's a little, the way he's telling the story is interesting, right? He does, and it does allow us, it really almost forces us to learn the story as David kind of waiting to get approval, Achitophel holding back for some reason, and then finally David getting it out of him. Here's from the worn trousers of the priest. Okay, so there's another Gemara which describes this further, in which David brings up the story goes that he pushes them back and then he raises them up to 15,000 amot beneath, to 1,000 amot beneath the earth. So it works in Rav Chisda's math, right? It starts at 16,000 amot down, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 it to 15, and then it gets to 1,000 amot below, and the Gemara continues there and says, the water cannot be too far from the earth because it sustains the world. So there's so we see in all these stories, there's the pushing back. It's a great story. In Halachic Man, Rav Soloveitchik, he's not interested in anything we're talking about here. He's interested in the shard, the law that holds desire back, right? He's the Halachic Man, right? As far as he's concerned, anything outside of that sphere, you try to bracket it as much as you can. It's not a really healthy way of living, right? Because it's a denial of those forces, and there's a relationship between the cosmic force and the psychological force, and this idea that I'm suggesting the divine unconscious kind of covers both of those things. Okay. Any questions up till now? I think we're now in a position to maybe start to answer some of the questions with which we started. Okay, so maybe a few
Can I ask
more.
a quick one?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Do we? You were talking about the fact that God is in the depths. To me, I think of the word Tahimus as as a negative, the depths as in like a bad place. Is that true, or is it using Psalms as just depths as in like a physical deep?
I think both. I think both. I mean, that's the thing about the depths, and that's the thing that Milton also gets right, is they have two different realities. And it depends, in a way, it depends on your temporal frame. In the moment, and David experiences this all the time, the depths are real and destructive, and are a power of destruction. On some other level, he acknowledges that God controls everything. It does, really, I mean, I don't want to turn the psalmist into a Spinozan, right? I mean, for Spinoza, God and nature are identical, right? And the psalmist is not doing that. But there does seem to be a part of the psalmist that acknowledges these forces. And what happens on Simchat Beit HaShoeva in this water drawing ceremony is that these forces come through. I mean, two things happen at this water drawing ceremony. On the one hand, they're drawing water in. They're also from reservoirs putting water in. It's like this, it's this kind of economy where water is being drawn out and water is being put in. And whatever those forces were that David wanted to keep close, but beneath, are finally able during Simchat Beit HaShoeva to come out. There's something distinctive about Sukkot as Chag, in which allows this to happen, which allows the Chachamim, the Anshe Maisa, the Tzaddikim, to harvest or draw out the Kadosh. Here's like the Spinozan part. Where does the Kadosh come from? The Kadosh comes from below, right? The Kadosh comes from the thing that is potentially dangerous. The Kadosh, it's interesting, like all these stories here. Why is the Beit HaMikdash founded on water, right? And the waters can't come too close, so they have to have kind of the same status as we saw in Psalm 46, where their destructive powers are somehow sublimated or somehow are able to come through in a way which is not dangerous. Dr. Feldman was pointing out to me, we spent some time talking about this, that, and this is, there's a machloket that I'm sure many of you know in the Gemara. The question is, when the psukim talk about sukkot or sukkahs, what are they talking about? And Rabbi Akiva, he says, well, the people in the desert, they actually built sukkot. And Rabbi Eliezer says, no, the sukkot are the ananei hakavod. And you can see really that's where any kind of mystical reading is going to start, where there is this kind of time of protection. And the sukkah itself represents that protection, but it's also, and remember that Sukkot comes at the end of two liturgical cycles, right? It's the end of the liturgical cycle that begins with Pesach, goes to Shavuot, and then goes to Sukkot. But it's also the end of the liturgical cycle that begins with Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, right? And in the Haftorah on Sukkot, the readings are from Zechariah, which are messianic, Gog uMagog, right? This whole idea that Sukkot represents some kind of messianic presence or some kind of safety in this world. So here, and again, we said before that it's working against the dualisms that we might be familiar with or might be comfortable with. And I'm saying here that the cosmology reflects a psychology, that an self has to go down first in order to go up. Dante knew this, Milton knew this, Blake knew this, everybody knew this, Shakespeare knew this. In order to go up, you must go down first. Because if you don't go down, there will be no foundation. You will not have the foundations to build. And that's really why the temple is, for Chazal, the temple is built on David's handiwork, keeping the water in its place. So, of course, we must think that when Rav Chisda, Gemara, tells these stories, of course, they have the Tehillim in mind. They're thinking about the David of Tehillim and thinking about David's relationship to water here. So here, and you can hear we're having a Simchat Beit HaShoeva in my house as we speak. So I want to just go back to the questions that I started with, the defecating sun worshippers, and what they represent and how they're part of the story. So I think one way of learning Pshat, I'll say, one way of learning this is you may think something about what Kedusha is, but the highest form of Kedusha is play. And the rabbis in the Simchat Beit HaShoeva are showing us how the energies that come from below, they are the source of Simcha, and they are the source of play. Now, interestingly, the Sadducee says, we don't care about this ceremony. This ceremony doesn't mean anything to us because they, as I said before, they do not follow Torah B'al Peh, only the written law. The worshipers who worship the sun and defecate, I think they're almost the key to the whole story, because the sun worshipers have a very particular relationship to the divine. The divine is just up there. And the Gemara says that they defecate. It's basically the Sadducee saying to the Pharisees, right? Saying to Chazal, this is what we think of your oral law, right? This is what we think of all the things that you do in the world. Our eyes are up. Interestingly, in Simchat Beit HaShoeva, the continuation, Rabbi Yehuda says, our eyes are on God. But it's through that ceremony of Torah B'al Peh that their eyes do go up. The Sadducees, again, they pour water on their feet. You have to think about that also. Why on their feet? And feet is our theme in the Gemara here. But they also, I think you compare them together, they are rejecting the oral law. And in rejecting the oral law, it's not just like, you have to understand what the oral law represents. I mean, it is just Talmud, but it's also not just Talmud. The oral law is a way of being in the world. The oral law is saying what we do in this world matters. The oral law is, it's not just God from above. We ourselves can do activities that bring Kedusha into the world. And what we get in Sukkot, on the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, this celebration, the highest form of Kedusha, this highest form is when brilliant people of action play. I think there's also pedagogy there as well. Not as well. It is pedagogy, that in order to learn, there has to be this sense of play. And the Esrogim, they fit kind of right into the story. The whole thing is just, there is this kind of comic element where really the laws that normally maintain or don't maintain there. Because Sukkot represents this kind of apotheosis of Kedusha. And in Simchas Beit HaShoeva, there is like this mutual reciprocal relationship between the divine and the human. I'm thinking a little bit of the child psychologist Winnicott, who would talk about certain stages in the infant's life where there's a kind of direct, unmediated relationship between mother and child, right? The mother suckling the child. And he builds a whole set of psychological theories around that event and what happens after there is that separation. It is for Winnicott and for others a way of kind of talking about this there's a very good book by the psychotherapist Adam Phillips. It's like a biography of Winnicott or on his work. There is like this sense of connection. Dr. Feldman mentioned that there's almost like the sense of being surrounded by water. Which of Homer's epics would this remind you of, Tikva? The water one, right? The Odyssey, where Odysseus is entirely surrounded by water. Of course, it's kind of dangerous for him there. Then he has to leave Calypso's island in order to become himself, because the water there is a force that will erase his identity altogether. So their water is a kind of destructive or minatory force. But here there is this sense of mutuality, people bringing water, people drawing water, this sense of like this interaction with the divine. And of course, it's something that can't happen all the time. It's like Purim. You can't have Sukkot every day, because that would destroy, because the world would get destroyed, right? Because the Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who is torches, you can't push your luck. You can't do that every day of the year, right? You can only do that this special time when the special relationship maintains. And this is this time in a way when the divine is kind of, forgive the metaphor, is kind of letting off steam in a way that's coming into the world. And we see that is the source of joy and of simcha. It's very interesting also, there are other Mishnayot which talk about, or Gemaras, where they talk about how they had to install bleachers so the women could watch, because in the beginning, the women and men were dancing. It's kind of the closest that Chazal gets to the Homeric celebration of marriage that you see, like at the end of book 24 of the Iliad, with or at the end of the description of the shield of Achilles. There are two cities on the shield, and around the shield are boys and girls dancing in a row. It's like this very celebratory image of men and women dancing together. You almost get this here. Of course, it turns out lahalacha, these Gemaras are the source for the mechitzas that we have in our synagogues now. Because of Kalot Rosh, they had to put women up in the bleachers, right? Just like if you go to the Chevron Yeshiva on Simchas Beit HaShoeva, you can watch your husband dance from above, right? I'm sure they do that at Lakewood also. The Avrei ex-wife come in and they watch their husbands dance, right? Whatever, right? Anyway, so it is this kind of beautiful celebration of play and of excess, and really the possibility of excess. I think also because we've gone through all of these holidays, God can trust us with it now, right? We can have this simcha now. So any questions or comments? I mean, let's talk a little bit about this, because this is a very, I don't know if it's an unconventional approach, but it's certainly an approach that I haven't seen. But I do think it accounts for a lot of these weird things that you see in the Gemara. And weird things that you see in the Gemara should not be dismissed as weird things in the Gemara. They should be dismissed as purposely weird things. They should be understood as purposely weird things, right? The throne is rokim. It's not just a throwaway, right? The defecating idolaters. It's not just a throwaway. The sun worshippers, right? I mean, let's nagid, like we have to be like the literalists and say, of course this happened, and maybe it did happen. But then the question is, why does this get included, right? And how is it included with the rest of the story? To look at the Talmud just simply as a historical account makes no sense, right? There may be history in it, but it's the history is told as story, and the Gemara encourages us, especially because of the way that it flows into each other, to read it as such.
Yeah, I have a couple comments.
Go for it, Tikva.
I think there's something to be said for the water as like water in the Beit HaMikdash is not only important as just like, a source of life and a symbol of like the duality of God, but also it's the symbol of purity. And everyone, and you purify yourself through with water, and that makes it another very important element. And the same is for fire. If you can, like a more like, how do you say this? Like a higher form of purification, if it won't kill you, is fire. And also about what you said about how these people don't have the Torah Sheba'al Peh. I think in a way, the Torah Sheba'al Peh is the play in Judaism. Like for me and the people I talk to, and we're throwing halachic theoreticals around and talking about, what would the life of a Jewish vampire look like? Like it is the fun, and it is the play.
Tikva, I've always said this about you, Tikva, you know how to party, right?
Yeah, it's
no, and wrong. I think that, and that going back to my like traumatizing experience in the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, this was you can't blame them, but it's like the cookie cutter. Oh, this is what we do at a Simchat Beit HaShoeva, and no. I mean, yes, if you want to, but you can also talk about vampire, whatever. That's also something.
Well, how did vampire keep halacha was the discussion.
Okay. That's what all these kollel guys do in order to get published. Like, you see like the halachas of, some very distinct thing, right? So you could do the halachas of vampires, but no, exactly what you're saying, really. And because of the halachic system and because of the sociology of Judaism in general, and especially today, that play is really, really, really pushed aside, right? And I think our Simchat Beit HaShoeva, that is play for us. That is your Simchat Beit HaShoeva. In fact, this for me is ours, right? Because we're actually talking and learning. And there is that play. And we are being Shovavim Kedusha. This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like.
Professor, teach and delight.
Yeah.
Teach
Pardon?
and delight. Teach and delight.
Teach and delight. I can always trust you to bring us back to Sydney or Aristotle, right? Or Sydney through Aristotle through Sydney. Right? No, for sure. Right. And that is the thing, is that we see that David in Psalms is encouraging worship with the whole body. I mean, there's a medrash here someplace, right? And we see it on Rosh Hashanah, right? That David he's not embarrassed to humble himself. And he dances and parties in front of God. And people come to him and say, David, what are you doing? Right? Tikva, what are you doing learning about vampires? Right? And David said, this is my worship. This is what I do. This is my Kedusha, right? And David, of all people, knows that it's not going to be the same for everybody.
Also, quick comment from the Ezrat Nashim, if you will. As a woman who loves dancing, there is nothing more depressing than standing upstairs and watching a bunch of men dance. It's the
depressing.
worst.
It's depressing for me to be one of the men. I mean, whatever. I mean, it's, there are certain things about the Jewish life which I've come to accept I will not really ever integrate well into. And, weiter, you try to go forward, right? Because we do have so many opportunities, and that's what we have to do, is be resources for each other that we can celebrate in the way that we want to.
Great.
Okay, people, listen, thank you so much. I'm so glad I got to speak to you guys. I'm happy to hang out for a little while if you want to, but we'll say the lecture is officially over now, okay? See, how are you? See, before you go,